Before we start coding, the last piece of configuration is to specify a Java compiler. This particular application was created using the Spring Toolsuite wizard. So it has a specific compiler already specified inside the effective POM. But for us, we are going to develop this application using Java 8 compiler. So we need to specify that. So what we have to do here, we have to specify a Maven compiler plugin. For that, what we are going to do, we are going to add a new section below the dependencies section, which is the build section. So I have just copy pasted the build section here. The procedure for getting the Maven compiler plugin is the same. Just go to Google, search for Maven compiler plugin, and I got this particular plugin. This is required to specify a particular Java version for your application. As you can see in the configuration section, I have a source and a target specified with a property Java version specified. So we need to specify a new property. So what we are going to do, we are going to add that particular property inside the properties section, Java version, and I will give the value as 1.8. So one thing you should remember, if you see any errors appearing in your application, it usually will be a default Java which is specified in your workspace, which doesn't match with the version specified in your POM file. So make sure that you add this particular Maven plugin and that error will go. Now we are all set to start coding. So based on the theory that we have understood, the first thing we are going to do is to create a SpringMVC configuration. So let us create a Java class to start configuring. If you remember, in the theory session, I gave the name of the Java class as webconfig. So I will give the same here. The first annotation that we are going to give for this particular class is @configuration. If you see, this configuration annotation is coming from the package org.springframework.context.annotation.configuration. The second annotation that we are going to provide is enable webMVC. There is one more annotation that we need to specify, that is @componentScan. The first two annotations, the @configuration and @enable webMVC, has already been discussed. The last annotation, the @componentScan, if you remember, in the XML file that was created by the wizard, there was a component scan pointing to a base package. The same functionality is done through this particular annotation @componentScan. What it effectively does is that wherever this componentScan annotation is there, the Spring will scan all the packages. So that means this webconfig class is now in the com.spring.legacy package. Because @componentScan is available in the webconfig, Spring will scan all the different classes available in the package com.spring.legacy and also all the subpackages of com.spring.legacy. We don't have any packages as of now, but there are other annotations. For example, there is a home controller with @controller annotation. This particular class has to be scanned by Spring and marked this particular home controller as a bean in the application context. So in the web config, this @componentScan is mandatory. Of course, we can give specific packages. I am not going into that for the time being. That is not our area. We are just trying to convert a SpringMVC application and eliminate all the XML files and introduce annotations. So that's all. So again, I am reiterating what is that we are replacing here. we are replacing the bean definition XML files. So web config corresponds to bean definitions, where we are specifying at configuration, at enable WebMVC and component scan. Again, if you remember, when we used the wizard to create the application, the view that was created or used was JSP. So what we need to do, we are going to create a bean for a view resolver so that any view will be resolved to JSP. So what we are going to do, I'm going to use an annotation at bean. I'm going to create a method which returns a view resolver. I will give the name of the method itself as view resolver. What we are going to do inside the method is we are going to create an internal resource view resolver. We create an instance of it. We specify the location of the JSP pages, which in our case is under WebINF views. And then we specify the suffix, that is the extension of the page. So we will put the set suffix and set suffix, which is .jsp. Once you do that, we just return the internal view resolver. So here you can see that of course I have created a method inside the web config class. I have given the name of the method as view resolver. It returns a view resolver. The implementation, the actual implementation is internal resource view resolver, where we specify the location of the views. If you remember, it is under the WebINF views. And we also specified what is the extension of our view, which will be .jsp, and we return the view. Those who are new to annotations in Spring, you may be wondering what this particular bean is all about. As I told you, any class that contains a configuration annotation means that that particular class can contain bean definitions. This is more or less equivalent. If you remember, I will just type in how it looks like in an XML file just for your information. It is just like the way we did in the XML file. Bean ID is equal to, then what we are going to do, the ID will be the name of the method specified here, ID, and the class that particular instance is going to be, we are going to give com.org.whatever, this internal view resolver. We copy the whole thing and paste it here. If you remember, this is how we used to create bean definitions in an XML file. This particular piece of code is exactly equivalent to the XML bean definition. So the way we used to define beans in XML files, this is how we do the same using annotations. I hope you are with me, you are getting what I'm telling. Okay, so because from the start I have been telling, we are eliminating XML files and using annotations only for developing our Spring applications. So definitely we need to have some place where we need to configure this stuff. So we are going to configure all these things in Java classes. For that, the important thing that you should remember is that that particular Java class where you define beans has to be annotated with @configuration. That's all for our WebMVC Spring configuration. So are we done with coding? Or are we missing something here? Again, I'm reiterating, this web config is a replacement for the bean definition XML files. But then, yes, we are forgetting to replace definition for the deployment descriptor, which is the web.xml file. So that's what we are going to do next. So let us create another class. I am going to name it as web application initializer. So in the same package I am creating another class. So I give the name web app initializer. Let me give the I also capital because that is the standard. So the name of the class is web app initializer. Okay, so what we are going to do in the web application initializer, this is the replacement for the deployment descriptor. So if you remember, there are three different ways we can replace the web.xml file. If you remember the theory, we can directly implement the web application initializer interface or extend one of the abstract classes given to us by SpringMVC. But here we are going to specify all these configurations using annotations. So what we are going to do, we will be extending from the abstract abstract annotation config dispatcher servlet initializer, and we are going to implement the methods. I hope those who have gone through the theory portion of the session will understand what I am talking right now. So this particular class, the web app initializer, which extends from the abstract annotation config dispatcher servlet initializer, is the replacement for our deployment descriptor. We already talked about the different methods and what they do. Because we don't have any root configuration classes, we are just keeping the code as is. We are interested in get servlet config classes and get servlet mappings. So if you look at the signature of the get servlet config classes, you can see it is asking for an array of classes. So what we are going to do, we are going to create a new instance of a class array, and then we will pass the configuration as an array. And what is the configuration? The web app, the web config dot class. So again, what we just did, the first thing that we did was we created a web config class with at configuration annotation and at enable WebMVC annotation and at component scan. Again, I reiterating, this web config is a replacement of our bean definition XML files. So instead of defining the beans in an XML file, we define beans in one of our configuration classes. And then what we did, that's all for our, because it is a very small application, we are not adding any functionality as of now. This is all that is required. And then we created a bean for view resolution to JSP page. And the next thing that we did, we created the web application initializer. Again, this is a replacement of our deployment descriptor or the web.xml file. So instead of implementing the web application initializer interface, we are extending from the abstract annotation config dispatcher servlet initializer, which is an implementation of the web application interface. And we override three methods. The two methods we are concerned about is the get servlet config classes and the get servlet mappings. In the get servlet config classes method, as you can see, the signature, it returns an array of class. So what we are going to do, we create an instance of a class array. Because we don't have many configuration, we only have just one configuration. Remember again, we have just one configuration annotated with that configuration. So we are only passing that into the array. So we have only one configuration in this application. And then what we are going to do, we need to specify a mapping to our dispatcher servlet. And again, if you look at the signature, it is a string array. So the way we did before, we are going to create an array of string, and then we are passing in the context. So here we are concerned about the route context to the dispatcher servlet, and this is all we need to do. So now we have completed configuring our application. So let me see if I am missing anything here. So again, reiterating, we started with the web config, which is a replacement of the bean definition files. There is only one bean specified, and that bean instance is the view resolver interface. 2, we created a web application initializer, which is a replacement of the web.xml file, extending from the abstract annotation config dispatcher servlet initializer. 2 methods of concern is the getServletConfig classes and the getServlet mapping. In the getServlet config, we pass in the configuration of bean definitions, and the getServlet mapping is a mapping to the dispatcher servlet. Now our coding is complete. So again, reiterating, we have deleted all the XML files. No XML files to be seen in our application. We have replaced those XML files with code. To complete our application, we want to see whether this application works without the XML files. So we go to the server section. If you remember, in one of the sessions before, we had configured the Tomcat. I am going to deploy the application Spring Legacy into the server. I will publish it so that the code is moved to the corresponding location. So once it is synchronized, I will start the server. If everything goes well, let's wait for the server to start up. Yeah, I think everything went well. Go to localhost 8080 Spring Legacy. Let us wait for the page to come in. Oh, it took a while to start up. Maybe it shouldn't be the case. So what the error just told us is that in the timeout section, we are telling through configuration that the Tomcat server should start up within 45 seconds, and because it took some more time, I am going to increase the time, save it, and start it once again. Of course, the application was picked up, so our application should be working fine. Anyway, let me wait for the server startup to complete. So now the server startup is complete. So now let me refresh and see whether I think there is a problem in our configuration. So let us see what was the problem. Webinif views. I think I forgot the /. These are some of the problems we Java developers face every time. So actually it went into the home controller. You can see the request went into the home controller, and this log message was logged into the console. But when it tried to get to the home page, we got an error in our JSP. That means the views home, because there is no views home.jsp, it couldn't find. So it threw an HTTP 404 exception that the resource is not available. So what we need to do, we need to correct our application. So I have corrected the application. I am going to restart, because this was a change in code. I am going to restart the server once again. Yep. Now let us see whether our application is working or not. So now you can see the application was deployed successfully, and you can see the JSP output coming from our application. So let us conclude this session with a brief on what we did so far. Step 1. What we did, we created a SpringMVC application using the Spring Tool Suite wizard. And this application was created using the help of XML files, if you remember, or just go through the sessions that we have done so far, the first and the second slides, where we were using XML files. Then step 2, what we did, we deleted all the XML files, created the corresponding configuration classes that replaced the XML files, and deployed it again. So all these configuration classes were using annotations. So that concludes our discussion on how to create a SpringMVC application just by using annotations. This particular understanding, even though I am not expecting to have deep knowledge of each of these annotations, but this particular understanding of creating a Spring application using annotations will go a long way in understanding the mechanisms of Spring Boot. So in the next session, we will add Spring security to it, and that too with annotations. Okay, so that's it for now. Bye from me.